I'm Janice Ballou, Chair of the AAPOR History Committee. It's May 4th, 2018, and we're in Princeton, New Jersey at the Princeton University Broadcast Center. I'm so pleased to be able to conduct this interview with Michael Kagay. Just want to give you a quick bio of Mike. He is unique as one of our illustrious members, in that he's served his career in 3 different types of organizations. He started as an academic, then he went to a commercial firm, and then finished up in a media firm. He started here at Princeton. He and I, full disclosure, worked together at Lou Harris during the 80s. And then he finished his career for many years at the New York Times CBS poll. So with that little quick bio, we're going to start our interview and hear from Mike. As I mentioned, this is an AAPOR Heritage interview, and Mike served the AAPOR organization in 2 major roles, in addition to his participation as a member. In 1990, he headed up the conference committee, which is a major job, and then he served as our president from 1998 to 1999. So we're really, really pleased to include you in our Heritage interview series. So let's begin by just giving us a little more opportunity to learn about you. Give us a little snapshot of your history growing up and your education, just to give us a sense of your formative beginnings.
Well, I grew up in Columbus, Ohio, and my wife grew up in Troy, which is north of Dayton, Ohio. And we first met at Miami University in Oxford, Ohio, which is north of Cincinnati, or between Dayton and Cincinnati. And in fact, we met the first day of a freshman political science course. We just happened to be seated next to each other, and I still remember the blue jumper that she wore at that time. We didn't marry until about 5 years later, but we knew each other all the way through college, and dated. I remember taking a public opinion course at Miami, but it was not grounded in survey research so much. In those days, public opinion, you may recall, was often considered, well, that's local newspaper editorials. That's public opinion, right?
Yeah.
You gather those from across the country, and you've got it. Well, and although Gallup had been at work for decades by that time, this was not a really quantitative course. But I remember having just a fleeting career thought during that time. Wouldn't it be interesting as a career, to work at the Gallup poll at some time? And then I thought, nah, will never happen, never happen. Carol and I got married in 1965 and went into the Peace Corps for 2 years in India. And India is a mind-boggling experience. I mean, in terms of the variety of languages, religions, cuisine, local customs, it's like having all of Europe in one country. And it also means it's difficult to generalize, because if you go 200 miles in any direction, you face a very different combination of all those factors. And Carol and I were teachers, and eventually ended up in sort of teacher training there. And we lived in a town, Bhopal, which was a provincial province or capital. So we met typically not your typical Indians who are more rural, but we had some anthropologist friends who lived in a village and in a much more agricultural setting, who told us a story one day that just I couldn't believe. In undergraduate work, I had bought my own copy of The American Voter by Campbell, Converse, Miller, and Stokes. That was published in 1960.
Now, was it for a course, or you just happened to buy it?
No, I happened to buy it. I'd read about it. It was just published. And I went up to the local bookstore, and they said, well, we have a copy here on the shelf. It had been ordered by the chairman of the political science department, but he's on leave, so we'll sell it to you, and we'll order him a new copy. So I had read parts of it, and there is one chapter in there, which I think was probably written mainly by Philip Converse, about levels of conceptualization, where you've got ideological thinkers who discuss politics in ideological terms at one level. Below that is the sort of group benefits level, which was the largest, because most people seem to evaluate politics and discuss it in terms of, is it good for my group? Who's it good for? How bad is it for the Jews, and so on. And there's lower levels yet. There's sort of the no issue content level toward the very bottom. But at that time, in the 50s, when they analyzed the open-ended comments on surveys, which they developed this from, it was only like 3 or 4% of Americans had that no issue content at all. Well, let me tell you, our anthropologist friends overheard villagers discussing politics one day. And in India, because of vast illiteracy at that time, each party had a symbol which would be associated with banners at its rallies, printed on all the flyers or posters, advertising, and would also be on the ballot. So even an illiterate person
would know
which choice to make on the ballot.
Yeah.
Well, there were numerous parties. The establishment party at the time was the Congress Party, but there are many others. I remember Congress used as its symbol a pair of bullocks, which would be widely used as the main beast of burden in India for plowing fields. And there was a Hindu nationalist party called Jan Sangh, I believe, and its symbol was a oil lamp. And these two villagers, one asked either, who are you voting for in this upcoming election? And the second villager said, well, I'm voting for the lamp, because without light at night, where would we be? And the first villager said, that's stupid. I'm voting for the bullocks, because without bullocks, we couldn't raise food, and we'd have nothing to eat. Well, even at that point, early in my political science career, I could recognize that's a whole level below anything that Philip Converse dealt with. I mean, there's no content at all. No policy content, no issue content. It's as if two American voters debated American political parties in terms of the animal behavior of elephants and donkeys. Well, the elephant has a long memory, well, but the donkey can pull a plow, So,
so that was your start of public opinion?
Well, I mean, I was
very basic level.
I'd already sort of read myself into
it.
So the next stage for us was, by the end of our 2 years in India, Carol and I realized that we both wanted to go to graduate school. So we needed a major university that was strong in both English literature, her field, and political science, my field, and that answered as mail. We were surprised, and you might be too, that at that time anyway, there were major universities who did not answer mail from India. And so we would write for applications and catalogs, and many of them just never arrived. So fortunately, the University of Wisconsin in Madison satisfied all our requirements. And
obviously, this is a time before internet connections, right?
Yeah.
This is what we're talking about.
Snail mail, yeah.
The late 60s, early...
This would be 65.
Okay,
yeah.
mid-60s.
And so, after returning to the U.S., although neither Carol or I had ever set foot before in Wisconsin, we packed up a rental van and drove all our stuff to Madison. And we thoroughly enjoyed our years in Madison. It was one of the most lively and interesting, exciting, and liberal places we had ever lived. Now, and maybe many people recall that graduate school days along the same lines. I don't know, but certainly it was true for us. And at first in Madison, I wasn't sure what part of political science I really wanted to specialize in. And I flirted for a while with Congress and legislative behavior. But as it turned out, sort of luckily, I guess I can say now, the faculty who taught Congress were often off in Washington with their grants doing their research and were not actually available. So I fell in with Donald McCrone and Jack Dennis, who specialized in political behavior, survey research and polling, political socialization, which was a hot topic then. And they were usually on campus and available because they took advantage of the Wisconsin poll.
Oh, right.
The Wisconsin poll then, and maybe still, was a twice yearly statewide probability sample of Wisconsin residents that the university did for the state. And half the questions were reserved for the farmers in the sample. Your expectations for the next year's crop or herd, but the sample was of the entire state. And so the other half of the questions were up for grabs, so to speak, and faculty would compete to get their questions on the poll. And so McCrone and Dennis had collected quite a few topics, worth of questions, and I would say that for me, this was the first contact with primary data analysis. I mean, I had done secondary analysis of other people's polls, but you felt they'd been picked over pretty well by the time you got to them.
Right.
But this was
they were available though, right?
yeah. But it was good training.
Yeah.
And this was my first primary data where nobody else had looked at it before. And I remember thinking at the time, this is pretty interesting. I mean, it's quantitative because being based on a probability sample, one could project the results to the entire state. We weren't just talking about biographical information from certain individuals. It was a projectable sample, but it also dealt with real people in that analyzing surveys never lets you get too far away from the real people who express those opinions or behavior. So I was hooked and have been for 50 years.
Yeah. You're creating information, you're answering questions that you have. It's quite a privilege, actually.
Trying to think.
So after did you get involved in the Wisconsin poll, or only when you had a chance to do questions
No,
on it?
I was essentially a research assistant to Professors McCrone and Dennis.
Okay.
And so I got involved that way. I guess my own greatest achievement in graduate school was getting Fortran, computer language, approved as my foreign language. I had just about resigned myself to brushing up my undergraduate German, at which I was never very good, when the graduate school, in its wisdom, and to my thinking, in the nick of time, decided to leave the language requirement up to individual departments, figuring they would know best. And the political scientists allowed themselves to be convinced that the Fortran computer language would be just fine for my purposes.
That's wonderful.
And
I love that story.
I'm going to say that in the years following, I certainly used Fortran much more than I would ever possibly have used German.
Right.
At which I was pretty poor at. Anyway, so
did you do your dissertation on public opinion?
Carol and I accompanied Don McCrone to England for a year at the University of Essex. There was an exchange between Wisconsin and Essex. And we taught the methodology course and associated things. I did my dissertation research there. So my dissertation was based on a poll of Colchester, Essex, England voters as the general election approached there. And then I analyzed it back in Madison. And but toward the end of my graduate school days, I had what I would call a major juncture in my career. I had won a congressional fellowship sponsored by the American Political Science Association that funded a year in Washington, working in a congressional office and giving me a real upfront chance to observe legislative behavior. And that was exciting. And so I was kind of inclined to do that. Terrific. But then, to my surprise, I won a National Science Foundation postdoctoral fellowship.
You had two choices?
Yeah. And the political scientists are not political scientists for nothing. The establishment of the profession had convinced the NSF just in the prior year to include political science among the eligibles for postdoctoral fellowship. So I was in or I would be in the first batch they'd ever awarded. So that was attractive too, because there was the novelty. I mean, no one had done that before that I knew. And but it was a very different choice. One would be sort of digging the same hole deeper,
With Congress? With
No. Well, see, I proposed going to the University of Michigan and tenuring the fellowship at the Institute for Social Research,
Okay.
which for 20 years by that time had done the National Election Survey.
Right.
And
Wow.
so that's why I said that
Yeah.
taking that choice would
Yeah.
dig the same hole even deeper, whereas going to Washington would not only satisfy a long-standing interest of mine, but take me in a different career direction too, probably. So I remember going around each of my faculty mentors and to seeing what they would advise. And there was only one, God bless him, who said, "Go to Washington, Kagay, enjoy it." All the others, which must be 4 or 5 faculty members, said, "Go to Ann Arbor. That'll do much more for your career." And so I did. I was usually open to advice, and so we packed up our what was it, 64 Plymouth, and took off for Madison to Ann Arbor. And as I say, the Institute for Social Research had been doing the national election surveys for 20, maybe 25 years by that point. This would be 1971. And there are many other political polls, Gallup and the media polls and so on, but I've always thought of them as the frigates and PT boats of the survey research Navy. The National Election Survey is in a completely different category.
Yeah.
And it costs a huge amount of money. It takes years to prepare.
Yeah.
Involves face-to-face interviews with a random sample across the country, and then takes years to analyze it in some cases. And but it's kind of like the analogy to a nuclear aircraft carrier is apt, because it's slow to change course. It can't turn on a dime. It can never include like the latest issue or scandal or personality. And it's on a higher, sort of more abstract level than that. And I had the feeling for anyone intended to go into polling and survey research, one had to see firsthand at some point how the admirals in Ann Arbor, loaded up the nuclear aircraft carrier with every survey research weapon system they could devise.
So it was sort of, in the way, the gold standard.
Yeah.
And that was the way to,
right.
You could compare everything once you had the gold standard in place. And what role did you have there?
Well,
as a
postdoctoral fellow, I could take courses. I could speak with the faculty. Most of them, I think, was to watch how they operate.
Okay.
For instance, I knew Warren Miller mainly from his publications, and didn't realize until I had watched him for a while that at that point in his career, he was actually spending most of his time raising money. Grant applications to the government or to foundations. He had a whole institute or center of scholars to support and to fund. And I hadn't appreciated that. Wisconsin, at least in my field, didn't have anything quite like that. And so that was always invaluable. I always appreciated Warren Miller. I was not one of his degree students, so he had no particular obligation, but he was always very generous and helpful.
And how many years were you in Ann Arbor with this?
1 year.
1 year.
But it was a very important transition year, because our son was born that year.
Okay.
And I was on the job market, doing job interviews that year, as well as my studies and duties as a fellow.
Were you working on a particular topic or subject in terms of your research at that time, or just absorbing everything that you could in Ann Arbor?
Well, as a postdoctoral fellow, you're no longer a graduate student, but you're not quite
Yeah,
a faculty member or an independent scholar yet. But that was an important transition year because I was making just that shift.
Okay.
And I remember interviewing at Stanford and not getting that job. Interviewing again at Princeton, and they called one day and offered me a job in the political science department and the Woodrow Wilson School, which is Princeton's counterpart of the Kennedy School at Harvard. When I arrived at Princeton, the university had been a major player in public opinion and polling over decades. Public Opinion Quarterly was founded and edited and published here. The Gallup archive of polls was once here, but later moved. And Harwood Childs, who retired in 1966, had taught public opinion for 35 years. And I came in 72, and unfortunately, I never got to meet Childs because he was killed in an auto accident that same year that I arrived. But my mentor on the Princeton faculty, Stanley Kelly, once described Harwood Childs to me as a chain-smoking Calvinist. And I thought, well, that told me a lot of what I might want to know.
Now, was this happening at Princeton because the Gallup organization was in Princeton? Was the firm in any way involved with the university, or?
Well, nobody then on the faculty except Stanley Kelly seemed to know anybody at any of the local firms. So if there were once close relationships, they had decayed.
Yeah. Okay.
And I think a lot of it had to do with Harwood Childs retiring, because at Princeton, if no current active senior faculty member has an interest in particular things, it just dies away. I mean, the institution itself would not be retaining Public Opinion Quarterly. I'm sure that's due to Harwood. So there were a lot of fences to mend and former relationships to rekindle. And
that became your job?
I saw it as my mission. I mean, for instance, the Public Opinion Quarterly had died. After Harwood Childs retired, my senior colleague Edward Tufte, who went on to Yale, inherited the course, and he taught it in a lecture bowl or an amphitheater that has tiered rows of seats behind desks. And when Tufte came to teach it the first time, he described to me, it had become a gut in Harwood's later years, a favorite with all the athletes. And when Tufte came in to teach it for the first time, he looked up and saw 50 pairs of sneakers staring him in the face. Well, Ed didn't suffer fools like that, gladly, and he saw to it that the course died and was stricken from the catalog. So when I came, there was not even a course anymore. And so we reestablished it, which took about a year, as I recall. And so I taught it then 9 times out of 10 years.
Uh-huh.
And we tried to revive relations with the local pollsters at the local firms. And our first step on that was to create the Central New Jersey chapter of AAPOR.
Oh, okay.
Bob Bazilla, who was the head of one of the local firms called Benson and Benson, took the lead. And his reasoning was that while the senior staff at many of the local firms knew one another and they would meet annually at the conference, that they didn't really see much of each other in between. And the junior staff at most firms knew only people in their own firm and did not have much of a sense of a wider profession.
Right.
So we thought, well, let's start a local chapter. I mean, there were other chapters already were in existence, so it's not a new idea, but it was new for here. And that was about, I would say 75, 76, 77. And for 25 or 30 years after that, well, it had been a big success and had, I think, reestablished contacts among academics and commercial people and students
Yeah, I remember attending, being here in New Jersey.
Yeah.
And just as a little personal note, met George Gallup in the cloakroom at one of those Central New Jersey meetings. So that was it was very momentous to me. So I'm glad you got that started, Mike.
Well, at that time, not only was George Gallup still active, but some of the other pioneers were around. And it was a thrill, to meet them. And
wow, it looks like you did a lot here at Princeton to bring things back.
Well, the third step, or the next step, was to re-involve some of the commercial pollsters in teaching. And my first attempt at that was to invite Irving Crespi, who was executive vice president at the Gallup poll, to lead one of the discussion groups in my course. And that helped, but it wasn't quite what I was looking for. So my next step was to involve two executives at ORC, the Opinion Research Corporation, in actually teaching some seminars. And for 2 years in a row, we did a national poll in which the students studied and debated and formed the topics, then wrote the questions for the poll, and analyzed the results once the poll was done. And ORC did the heavy lifting of sampling, interviewing, and data processing. Well, the students' collective paper actually was nominated for and won
the
AAPOR
Award.
Student
As you
Paper
were saying
Award
that.
in, I think it was probably 1982.
I was, as you were telling that story, I was thinking about that. That was one of the longest list of AAPOR Award paper winners, because it was your class, I guess.
I think there was like a dozen.
Yeah, terrific.
All of them went into law, as at that time Woodrow Wilson School majors typically did. Only one, Keating Holland, went into survey work, but he's been he's done a good job. He was with the CNN poll for a while.
That sounds like you did a lot of fence mending, and I think that's really kind of at the core of AAPOR too, the collaboration between academics, commercial, and the government. It just is a place, one of our slogans, a meeting place, but it's a place where you get to exchange those kinds of experiences so you're not so much in these silos, that you really try to integrate. So
about this time, I had another major career juncture to deal with. I had a job offer from CRS, the Congressional Research Service in Washington, which would have kept me in research, but not academic research. But it would have taken me to Washington. And still in the back of my mind was that notion that wouldn't that be interesting, to see that up close. I mean, I'm not a political scientist for nothing either, and I like to see some politics. But I finally decided, much the way I had earlier, that better to keep plowing the same field if you're serious about it, than to sort of switch. And so I remained at Princeton, and in my memory at least, it was just after that the New York Times called and said they were looking for an academic polling consultant, and would I be interested? Well, would I? At the time, I wasn't quite sure how they got onto me. Later, I was told that when the Times started looking for a consultant, they called Warren...
Matovsky?
No.
Warren Miller?
Warren Miller at the University of Michigan, and asked him, do you have any recent students living in the New York area who might be interested in this? And I don't know how many Warren suggested, maybe several, but they called me as one of them, and we had an interview, and eventually I got the offer. Well, that took me into a whole new field. I mean, polling, not academic polling, where you're polling to test, to build theory and to test it, but polling for news. And
so where did the Lou Harris time periods?
It
was after, so that the times were before and after?
Yeah, it bracketed.
Oh,
Harris.
okay.
So,
I didn't realize that.
So we're now talking about 1977.
Okay.
And the person who called me was Henry Lieberman. And Henry, to look at him, he was like an old school newsman. He had a stubby cigar, Henry was in his 60s, and his doctor no longer allowed him to smoke the cigar, but he chewed on it every once in a while. I never saw him without it. But although he may look old school, Henry was actually a new breed of newsman. He was an engineer by training, a very unusual background for somebody in news. He had been science editor previously, and he had overseen all the Times' coverage for the first man landing on the moon. Wow. And then as I say, he was in his 60s by then. So as his final assignment, I'm sure he saw it that way, the executive editor put him in charge of what was called at that time special projects. And the mission was to increase the amount of quantitative news in the A section, or what we would call the A section today. In those days, the Times' image of its general news reader was not of a very numerate person. I mean, the business pages had a much more intense level of charts, graphs, tables, and so forth than the A section did. And so Henry's mission was, what steps could he take to beef up that? And so the first thing he did, he put the Times bestseller list, which had been around since the 1930s, on a much more solid foundation. It used to be a kind of canvas of what you might call the carriage trade shops, the best bookstore in each town. So, well, under Henry, it became a probability sample of every bookstore in the country.
Wow, so that's how the polling at the time started, with the book section.
Well, this is Henry's first step. I mean, he had a master plan, I'm sure, which he discussed occasionally with me. But the bestseller list was an already established feature of the time. So you can start with that and just make it better. And so the bestseller list after that was produced by a weekly interview with a staff member at each bookstore. And then the key punching the data, processing on a computer, and then projecting it through a model to the entire population of bookstores.
So just to clarify, were you working with him on this book project?
Well, he hired me as a consultant.
On the books?
Yeah, and I wasn't working directly on the bestseller list. My other members of his staff were.
Okay.
And I could observe what was going on and trying to ferret out, what his master plan might be. The second.
And are you still teaching at the same time? I'm just trying to.
Oh, yeah. So this was a part-time.
Okay.
Part-time job for me. And Henry's second step was polling. Up until 1972, the Times, like most other newspapers, would occasionally print results from Gallup or Harris or Yankelovich or others. But after the Kennedy-Nixon contest and the Goldwater-Johnson contest, papers were feeling that wasn't really enough. And then they wanted something more customized, both in the sense of being responsive to the news, but also probably an exclusive thing, which was not just syndicated to many papers, but would be a Times poll. And so in 1972, the Times joined with Time magazine in a joint experiment and hired the Yankelovich firm to do the sampling and interviewing and data processing. And I read the report that came out of that at the end, and they thought that was a useful step in the right direction. But as they reflected towards the 1976 campaign, they thought, well, wouldn't it be even more responsive and exclusive if we could do the polling ourselves? Well, the Times was in no position to do the polling themselves, so they cast about for a partner who had more experience. And at that time, at least two, and I think only two, of the networks were doing their own polling. And they had developed the infrastructure that one needs in terms of computers and statisticians and analysts,
And
mainly in connection
interviewers,
with
right? Because most and interviewers.
Oh yeah,
You have to have
interviewers.
the field operations. Yeah.
But they were compelled to do that because of their investments in election night coverage. And so then the question was, what do you do with these people between elections? Well, polling was a transferable mission that you could give them. So Henry spoke, I was told, with both folks at the NBC poll and the CBS poll. And I was not present, but in terms of what I was told, NBC offered the Times exclusive print rights to the NBC poll. All right, well, maybe that would be a kind of a price for a partnership. But when CBS, and we're talking more Matosky here, and his boss at the time, offered the Times a complete joint partnership, that appealed to the Times' sense of itself. And so for the 1976 election year, the Times and CBS inaugurated a series of a program of polling that lasted all year and combined monthly national polls with election day exit polls during the primary season and again in the fall.
And you were involved in that?
No, I was not.
Not yet.
Their
Waiting.
Their academic consultant at the time was Gary Orrin of the Kennedy School at Harvard. And at the end of the 1976 year, the experiment ended. Orrin went home. The contract between the Times and CBS News expired, and I think their initial thinking was, well, this made sense. It worked, and we'll do it again next election. But they didn't count on Henry Lieberman. Part of his master plan was to pose the question, might polling produce interesting stories, news stories, on issues and personalities during the periods between elections? Well, and so that's the point at which he called me, okay, and said, so I first looked at the program of polling they did in '76. I was very impressed. I mean, but there was no election connected with the polling now, and this would be '77, and but it was Jimmy Carter's first quarter in office. The energy crisis was about to happen, and there were many issues that one could poll that are interesting, but not connected with any election. Now, I actually was confident that could succeed, because Gallup, after all, had been doing this for almost 40 years by that time, and managed to find interesting things during election years and non-election years. But the Times had not yet proven that with its own poll, and in its own pages. And so that's what we set out to do for '77. And I think if we had failed, the poll would have disappeared until the next election in 1980. But we didn't, and so that they renewed my
consulting, because you're still at Princeton, right?
Consulting job, yeah, for 78 and 79 and 80, 81, 82. But by the early 80s, I could see that my academic days were dwindling down. I was spending about half of my time in educational administration. By then, I was the associate director at the Woodrow Wilson School, in addition to teaching my traditional course in public opinion. So I was alert to possibilities at the local firms, but there were really no openings at that particular time. And as you may know, if a person is interested in breaking into a commercial polling firm, timing is the most important thing. You've got to have your resume on the desk of the person who can make that decision, or at least push it along to the next person who makes the decision. And there was just nothing happening at the time. So the other possibility was Donald Stokes, who was the dean of the Woodrow Wilson School, knew Humphrey Taylor at the Lou Harris and Associates, and had known him since England, I think, over a number of years. And so I got an interview and then an offer at Harris. So that's the next major juncture in my career. I mean, I was in the same field, yeah, but it's a different branch, you know.
Right.
And so,
although Lou Harris did a lot of polling too, so you had part of the connection of what you had been doing
Sure.
with your
Sure.
little, with your brief tenure, a little tenure you had at the New York Times.
Well,
because they, you know, Lou thought of himself as one of the supreme pollsters at that time.
as he would let you know.
Yeah.
This would have been 1982, so Princeton had a counter offer, I recall, which was to go into administration full time. As I recall, it was like assistant dean of students at the Woodrow Wilson School. But its attractiveness was, well, I could continue in the academic environment. My wife worked here in town. My son was in school in the Princeton public schools. We hadn't yet been able to afford a house, but you know, we lived in town for 10 years by that time, so we had a lot of friends, and so it was attractive from that point. But the Harris offer would be another step, you know, in a field that I by that time had been committed to for 10 years, 15 years maybe. And so although commercial research seemed like a whole new world, and required me to commute several hours every day, because we never gave any thought to moving into New York. I bit the bullet, and starting in the summer of '82, I joined Harris. Now, at that time, Humphrey Taylor, who was president of Harris, had managed to create a division that specialized in surveys for foundations and nonprofits. And that was the one that I was attached to. And later became the head of that department when the incumbent moved on to open a West Coast office for Harris.
I don't want to rush you into the New York Times part of the story, but we've got a few other topics to cover.
All right.
So,
you got to watch.
This has got the background on Harris. What made you leave Harris after? It sounded like you found the niche with the nonprofits and the foundations.
I was at Harris for 5 years.
Yeah.
And we did a lot of interesting projects like access to health care, problems facing teachers, problems facing handicapped Americans, and then
disability research was one of the few things that Harris was really known for.
And this was a line that Humphrey had developed.
Right.
And,
right. So you were feeling it was a good choice.
It wasn't bad. I enjoyed my years there, and I learned a number of things, like how to write faster than I had before, how to delegate. Academics are famous for, wanting to be involved in each step of their research. But at a commercial firm, you've got to delegate to the sampling department for that part of it, the data processing department for that part of it, and so on. I had to learn that. And also, a very valuable discipline, how to look a paying client in the eye and tell them what actionable decision they should take based on all the data you had just analyzed. Academics don't have to do that. You can say, on the one hand this, on the other hand that, and never really come down. Well,
that's an interesting observation, right?
But what happened one day was that
how do you use the data?
Adam Clymer,
what does it mean?
who I'd worked with for 5 years at the Times, was clearly a different kind of newsman. I mean, when Clymer worked on a poll story, he came early, he stayed late, he took home printouts with him in between polls, would phone me or email me between polls to print out more tables for him or suggest new questions for the next poll. And so it was no surprise to anybody that when Henry Lieberman retired, after one person who turned out to be just a temporary incumbent, Adam became chief of polling at the Times. And so for the period, let's say, 83, 84, 85, 86, 87, during my Harris years, Adam was in charge of polling, and he called me from Australia. I remember where he was on vacation in 1987 and invited me to become his deputy. Well, that was a no-brainer. I mean,
and you had experience in the organization, and you
and I'd worked with him, so
Yeah, so it was all good things.
In fact, most of what I know about news, I learned from Adam, and so I resigned at Harris and moved to the Times, and then was there for 17 years until I retired. And,
do you remember any particular polls that you did, or anything that just stands out when you were at the Times that just you really felt made a difference?
I remember Adam once nominated as the most important poll he ever did, a poll that I was also involved in as a consultant. Excuse me. And that was the 1980 National Exit Poll, when Reagan beat Carter, surprising some of us who thought it was much closer than it turned out. And the narrative developing in the press at that time was the voters in the country had turned to the right, that this was an ideological choice. Well, to look at the exit poll, there was no such thing. I mean, voters did not really agree with Reagan on many issues. They had not suddenly shifted to the right. Rather, they had finally given up on President Carter as an ineffectual executive and were willing to give Reagan a chance, which he might deliver on or not. But it was not a deliberate ideological decision. Well, that enabled the Times to weave into its narrative about the election that it was sort of giving up on Carter as much as anything else, and that influenced what the Times did, and I think helped to preserve that as an optional interpretation, and it was based squarely on the exit poll. Other polls we did that I remember.
Your favorites?
Well, I used to carry around a card with subjects or topics that I was very much interested in pursuing if a news peg arose. And one such thing was during the Clarence Thomas hearings for his confirmation and the Anita Hill testimony, sexual harassment became a major topic. Well, that allowed us to, with a national sample of women, projectable to all women in the country, ask, in your experience, whether at work or at home or whatever, have you been sexually harassed? And we would not have been able to get a story like that in the paper unless the Thomas hearings had made that
right,
a headline kind of subject.
Right.
And so there are a number of things over the years like that.
That strikes me, especially now with the Me Too movement. Does that poll might be one of the first polls that address that issue? Do you think at that time? Because it's a very sensitive topic to call and ask people, or to ask people about in public opinion.
Probably there were academic specialists in that area. I think I remember some monographs, journal articles, maybe even books about it. But I don't think it was widely done in the news media.
Yeah. Wow. A breakthrough type of thing for sure at that time, I'm sure.
Other polls, I guess for me, the entire program of polling during 1998 was a major event because remember the Monica Lewinsky Clinton sex scandal broke early in the year and then continued all the way through the year and into the following year when impeachment finally took place and the trial in the Senate. And it startled many of us, many observers, that when the scandal first broke, Bill Clinton's approval rating went up. And we initially interpreted it as, well, this is kind of like a rally around the flag event. If there's a foreign crisis or an attack on Americans somewhere, you rally around the flag, but it would be temporary. It's usually fleeting. It goes up and down. It's a spike. It's a spike. So we started polling fairly frequently, so that we could chart how long it lasted, and and I remember one of the major television anchors at the time said, "If these charges are true, Clinton will be gone within a week." Well, a week came and went, and then months, and so by the end of the year, what we ended up with was a whole program polling, like a dozen or 15 national projectable polls of what Americans perceived and thought and judged before the scandal broke, afterwards with more specificity, and then throughout the hearings of the congressional committees, and then through impeachment, and even in the trial.
That's a terrific segue, because I want to ask you about AAPOR, and that was the focus of your presidential address. The focus of your presidential address included some of the statistics from this poll, and obviously you thought it was important, as at the end of your tenure as president, to present that as a key thing that our profession had contributed to, basically our United States, to the political system. So let me switch over with that segue to your involvement in AAPOR. You mentioned that you'd started out with the organization, the Central New Jersey AAPOR. Do you remember your early going to conferences early, or what you got started? Who started you going to conferences?
Well, I remember when I joined AAPOR at that time, a candidate for membership needed the signature of 2 current members. At some point, we dropped that. I mean, I don't even recall why it was required in the first place, but I
had never heard that before.
I was lucky enough to have George Gallup sign my application, and Donald Stokes. And I remember holding it and saying, well, with both Stokes and Gallup, I'll probably get in. They'll let me in. But.
And what was the year roughly?
Early 80s. No, no. Mid 70s. Sorry. At that time, Princeton's exam period was right during mid-May. Year after year, the national conference, occurred during either the reading period or the exam period or the grading period afterwards. And faculty members would be shot for desertion under fire if you left for multiple days at that time, because there's grading to be done. There are appeals, on senior thesis grades, and so on. You have a lot of obligations. So I never actually attended the national conference until I left
Academe.
Princeton and went to Harris. And that's one reason we started the New Jersey chapter, because I couldn't make it to the conference, but there are obviously other things that we could do.
So do you remember your first conference, where it was, offhand? When you were able to go?
I remember I went up for a day when the conference was at Great Gorge, New Jersey. I think it was a failed Playboy Club.
Yes.
Remember that?
Yes.
A resort thing.
Yes, I remember that well.
I don't know what year that was. Okay.
That was.
And then, of course,
it was the mid-'80s. That's, I think, 85.
With my students who won the Student Paper Award,
yes,
I drove them down to Baltimore, I think suburban Baltimore,
Hunt Valley,
to receive their award.
Was that Hunt Valley?
I don't know.
Yeah.
But I don't think I ever made it to the location in the old days.
The Buck Hill Inn.
Yeah, up in the Poconos.
Right.
So it had already expanded a bit by the time I got involved. So my first conference might have been, there was a lakeside resort in Wisconsin,
mm-hmm.
where the lake had barely cracked, the ice had barely cracked. That was one of the first. But I distinctly remember coming down for breakfast my first day and being waved over to a table by somebody I didn't know, but who had obviously spotted me as a newbie, in need of being taken under their arm. And I remember I met somebody famous at that breakfast table and thought, gee whiz, that's not what I'm used to. Because I came to think, as this time went on, that a major tradition of AAPOR that needs preserving, and has been to some extent, is the taking of the meals together.
Yeah.
In the old days, then, all meals were together, and more hotels were chosen so that AAPOR could kind of dominate the hotel.
Took over.
You weren't running into strangers, and I contrasted that with what I was used to at my other professional organization, which was the American Political Science Association, where there are usually thousands of people. The annual conference is held in like a high-rise hotel in a big city like New York, Chicago, Washington, San Francisco. And at about 6 o'clock every night, people disappear in 2s and 4s and 8s and 10s to restaurants around the city for dinner. And if you don't already know somebody, you can end up sort of pacing the lobby alone at about 6:30, along with other losers, who don't know anybody either. And I understand that in the years since, AAPOR had come to alternate between a resort-style place and a more urban place.
Yeah,
but that still preserves some of that older tradition, at least on the off years.
Do you remember what some of the key issues were being discussed at those early conferences you went to? Like, what was often, there's a methodological issue that sort of is key at some of these conferences because of changes that are going on in the field.
Well, a major change, which we've seen a later evolution of recently, was in the mode of interviewing. Interviewing once was all face-to-face, and the mode switched to telephone interviewing
right
about the time I got involved. And so when it came to switching again to, say, online interviewing, I was never bothered by that because I had seen one change in mode before and I could see another. But both face-to-face interviewing and telephone interviewing were based on probability sampling, whereas not all of the current online polling uses probability samples.
Right.
And so that's now a current issue that concerns many people in the field, but has an earlier counterpart.
Yeah. Right now, we feel that the field is in a big transition now because there's other data available, kind of the big data revolution. What's your sense of how AAPOR can fit into that role? If you have any thoughts on that as we kind of reflect on the number of years and the changes and issues, and some people have been so bold as to say, surveys are going to go away because you don't need them. You have big data. How would you react to that?
One of the questions I was anticipating was, whatever happened to polling at the New York Times? Maybe you were getting around to that.
No,
okay.
And we're winding down, so
okay.
please
and
answer
it
that, because
that
does reflect a lot of what's going on in the field. So please answer that. That's really very useful.
The Times has not yet made an announcement, and this is what, May
2018?
2018. But they're clearly in a period of reevaluating polling at the Times. And the department has sort of disappeared. I mean, the staff were all given buyouts. The head of the department was transferred to other duties. The 40-year partnership with CBS has been allowed to lapse. And while, as I say, they've not announced anything except that they're reconsidering the role of polls at the time, I think you may have put your finger on a factor that's in their minds. And Mark Schulman, in his interview in the same series, raised the same question about big data. I mean, although as a legacy of Henry Lieberman, polling had been a major source of quantitative information in the news pages for many years, we're now in an emerging era when there are all kinds of sources of data, of which polling is only one. And I think what may be happening at the Times is that they're figuring how to incorporate other forms of data into the coverage of opinion and elections. And when you're in that kind of a reassessment period, often it's best to go with new people, younger people who are not invested in the old ways that things have been done for years. And I think that could be what's happening right now. And my prediction is that by 2020, at least as far as the Times is concerned, we'll finally see where they're coming out and what their future of coverage of the elections and public opinion will be. And I mean, I'm not privy to the thinking of management, so I don't know where they're coming out. But I think you've identified the causal factor.
Well, we've got a couple minutes left. Is there anything we haven't talked about? Any messages that you really want us to take from this interview? I think you've had some very strong themes that'll be useful to some of those new, younger people coming in to remind of some of the background and how the careers developed of some of our key members, which is incredibly valuable for the history of the organization. But I want to give you an opportunity to, if there's anything that we haven't covered that you want to make sure that we mention here.
Well, looking back, I think I have enjoyed and appreciated sort of several metamorphoses in polling. Academic polling to build and test theory, commercial polling to provide actionable suggestions to the paying client, and polling for news, where the point is to be on the news, but to go a bit beyond it into some more general, permanent themes. Then the only thing I haven't done is polling by government. But nobody can do this all. So part of what I thought that I bring to all that is some perspective. I didn't have a typical commercial polling background. I didn't have a typical news polling background. But I always felt able to provide some non-news perspectives on it. I remember the first time I was in charge of a New York City poll, I almost felt embarrassed that I was not from New York City. I didn't grow up walking the big city streets. I didn't live in New York City. For God's sake, I lived in Jersey. But I came to think, well, that perspective was actually useful. And I think similarly, on other kinds of issues, my background, including growing up in Ohio, offers some differing perspectives than some other people had. And but the bottom line is that I still think that polling is a fascinating mixture of quantitative measurement and analysis and projection, but also real people, and that we never get too far away from the people who are offering us their opinions.
That's terrific.
I was hooked 50 years ago, and I still am.
We're so pleased to have included your experiences and observations in the Heritage interviews. Thank you so very much, and I'm just so pleased to include it in our series. Thank you very much, Mike.
Thanks for asking me.